Everybody, again, a Chodesh Tov. It's been a while since we've been together. First, today's Shiur is dedicated anonymously for the Refuah Shlema of Oksana Bat Bluma. Bezras Hashem, may she have a Refuah Shlema with all of the Cholei Yisrael. As you know, our course is about the letters of the Rambam and the introductions. Eventually, we'll get to the introductions of the Rambam as well. I hate to say it, this is not an inspirational shiur, so those who seek inspiration may go elsewhere, including some other classes that I give. This is an informational shiur, in spite of what people think, have importance also. Sometimes it's important to get knowledge of Torah, even if it's not automatically going to be immediately inspiring. The hope would be, indirectly, of course, when one is connected to the sweetness of Torah, there's an automatic inspiration, but it's not necessarily devoted to inspiration. I have to give that warning because sometimes people come in with certain expectations. So far, we've examined two letters of the Rambam. The first, just to remind you, was called Maimar Kiddush Hashem, or Igeres Hashmad, where the Rambam discussed the idea of martyrdom and when must a person give up his life before he renounces Judaism, etc. And this was a letter written to a number of communities that were undergoing Islamic persecution, and they were informed that by some rabbi that if they were to even profess belief in Islam, even in one sentence, they believe in Muhammad, whatever it would be, they are no longer Jewish, and God does not want their mitzvot. And the Rambam specifically went out of his way to dispel that idea. He says, whether or not you have to give your life, you're still a good Jew, even if you failed in that duty. And then the Rambam even suggested that you don't have to give up your life in a situation where the persecutor knows you're not sincere in what you say. Meaning, you got to say this line just so they'll take the knife off your neck, but they understand you don't really mean it. All right, so we went over, that was the Maimar Kiddush Hashem, which essentially was chizuk to a community that was undergoing religious persecution. The second letter dealt with the same type of historical circumstance, but it approached it from a different angle. That was the Geret Teiman, the letter to the communities in Yemen, which also goes by the later name Petach Tikva, just like the city in Israel, an opening of hope. And this too dealt with communities that were facing Islamic persecution, and the Rambam addressed the issue of messianism, of Mashiach, of Geula, of the fact that God will redeem his people, and before that redemption, there are going to be very, very difficult times. So Maimar Kiddush Hashem and Igeret Teiman were both confrontations with the issue of martyrdom and persecution. Maimar Kiddush Hashem was more mainly halachic in its analysis, and Igeret Teiman was a Maimar, an Igeret of Nechama, of comfort and chizuk. I think I had mentioned probably more than once that the Kehilot in Teiman were so grateful to the chizuk that the Rambam gave them that in fact they incorporated the Rambam's name in the Kaddish. So when we ask for Mashiach, Yiskadal v'Yiskadash Shmei Rabbah, so they would say B'chayechon of Yom Echon, U'v'chayei D'chol Beis Yisrael, may the Geula come in your lifetime and in the lifetime of all of Israel. And they would add the words U'b'chayei Marana v'Rabbana Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon, may the Mashiach come in the lifetime of Moshe ben Maimon. This was their response to Igeret Teiman. The Rambam himself left an instruction that Igeret Teiman be read publicly in its Arabic in all of the Batei Knesiyot, even though the Rambam admitted that this might be dangerous to him if the authorities hear that he's undermining Islam and the like. But the Rambam said, and it's not clear that this is a halacha, that it's worthwhile to endanger your life to bring chizuk to the congregation, to bring chizuk to the tzibor. He is willing to even put his own life at risk. This is also the source of the fact that many, many Yemenite communities from that day forward, they considered the Rambam to be their definitive posek meaning even when the Shulchan Aruch came out later, and the Shulchan Aruch was largely accepted as the authoritative code of Jewish law, especially by Sephardim, because Ashkenazim followed the Ramah, but the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo, became the code of Jewish law. But many of the Taimani communities, they did not follow the Shulchan Aruch per se. They followed and they still follow the Rambam directly. Now, there's not going to be a tremendous difference because in truth, most of the rulings of Rav Yosef Karo are in fact the rulings of the Rambam, because as many of you might know, Rav Yosef Karo had a rule in deciding among machloksim of poskim, and this is his famous 2 out of 3 rule. He identified 3 poskim that he considered to be the primary decisors of Jewish law. One was the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, one was the Rambam, and one was the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, and the Shulchan Aruch had a rule that he would normally follow the halacha based on 2 out of 3. Now, the truth of the matter is that really stacks the deck, because the Rosh, who was Ashkenazi, was always the odd man out, and the Rambam follows the Rif 90% of the time, but not always. So most of the time, the Shulchan Aruch, in fact, is the psak of the Rambam, but not always. And the Teimanim will not look at the Shulchan Aruch. The Teimanim will look at the Rambam. And this was in the aftermath of Igeret Teiman. So those are the 2 letters that we looked at. So today we are looking at the 3rd major public letter that the Rambam wrote. The Rambam has many, many letters, and we'll be looking at some of the private letters as well. But this too was a public letter, and this is called, again, Ma'amar. It's not called a letter, but it's called Ma'amar Techiyas HaMesim. The Ma'amar, the discourse on the concept of resurrection of the dead. It is a fairly long letter, again, written in Arabic and then translated into Hebrew. It's interesting. The Rambam's main translator was Yehuda ibn Tibon. The Ibn Tibon family were great translators from Arabic into Hebrew, and Yehuda ibn Tibon and Shmuel ibn Tibon, father and son, they translated like everything that the Rambam wrote in Arabic. They translated the Perush HaMishnayos. They translated the Sefer HaMitzvot. They translated the Moreh Nevuchim, and they translated a number of these public letters. But for some of the earlier public letters, it's very interesting. Igeret Teiman and Mamar Kiddush Hashem, we actually have multiple translations by different people. And the Ibn Tibon translations are usually very difficult to follow because they are very literal and they follow the syntax of Arabic, which is not always the same as Hebrew. They're hard to read. The other translations are much more flowing. So it's very, very interesting that when it came to Igeret Teiman and Mamar Kiddush Hashem, when Ibn Tibon, when Yehuda Ibn Tibon was given a copy of the letter from the Rambam himself, he then made it available to other translators. He says, "This is my translation, you can translate it." Unfortunately, when those other translators became more popular than his own, when it came to Ma'amar Techiyat HaMeitim, he refused to release the original Arabic. So he had the Arabic from the Rambam. He translated it into Hebrew. He did not release it to other translators. Now we do have other translations, but it became retranslated in a very odd, convoluted way. And that is, they took the Ibn Tibon Hebrew translation, they retranslated it into Arabic, and then they retranslated it into a more flowing Hebrew. So we do have multiple translations. But the Ibn Tibon translation, particularly of this letter, even worse than Igeret Teiman and Mamar Kiddush Hashem, is frankly difficult to follow. It is a difficult translation to follow. But one needs to know a little bit of history of the Mamar Techiyas HaMesim. And that is, the date is the secular date 1191. 1191, the Rambam died in 1204. So we're talking about 14 or so years before the Rambam's Petira. By the time the Rambam wrote Techiyat HaMeitim, all of his works have already been publicized. The commentary on the Mishnah, of course, which was early anyway, but the Mishnah Torah has been out there, and even the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed. So the Rambam is no longer an acolyte. The Rambam is no longer a young person who is not fully known. The Rambam is already the world-famous Rambam as we know him. And the problem was this. Even in the Rambam's lifetime, the Rambam was subject to a number of attacks. After his death, they intensified, but obviously the Mamar Techiyat HaMeitim was written in the lifetime of the Rambam. And the Rambam was often accused. Well, obviously in the Mishnah Torah there were halachic disputes, but that's not such a big deal. I mean, there's always going to be arguments in halacha, what's your source, etc. And the Rambam was criticized not only for the substance of the halachic ruling, but the fact that he did not give sources for his halachic rulings. Okay, those were relatively minor criticisms. But the Rambam was also accused theologically of being an apikoros, of being a heretic, of being a person who did not deserve a share in the world to come. And in particular, the Rambam was accused of denying the idea of Techiyas HaMeisim, that the Rambam was said to believe that the only reward that one gets after one's death is the reward of the soul in Olam Haba. And in Olam Haba, there is no body, there is no eating, there is no drinking, there is no physicality. There is only the spiritual survival of the soul with joyous, eternal communion with God. And therefore, the idea that the body is going to be resurrected was considered to be, at least again, the Rambam was accused of not believing in physical resurrection of the dead. And based on the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, a person who denies Techiyat HaMeitim is an apikoros, is a heretic, and ein lo chelek liolam haba. Now that is a fairly severe accusation that the Rambam was an apikoros. And the Rambam felt it was necessary for him to defend his position, or at least explain his position. And the truth of the matter is, the Rambam's position is actually a bit strange, a bit ambivalent. And one actually wonders what his true belief might have been, because there is a lot of uncertainty here. On one hand, the Rambam points out the following. The Rambam points out that all the way back to his commentary on the Mishnah, which the Rambam authored around the age of 30, a number of decades before. So remember that the 11th parak of Sanhedrin, which is called Perek Chelek, that's the one that says, Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Chelek. Every Jew has a Chelek in Olam Haba. Of course, that sounds real good until you just read the next sentence. However, the following people do not have a, so it's not as all-inclusive as one would hope. In the Rambam's Mishnah, Perek Chelek is not the 11th Perek of Sanhedrin as it is in our Gemara, as it is number 10. Okay, that makes no difference. But in his commentary to the Mishnah on Perek Chelek, the Rambam gives a very, very important introduction. It's called the Hakdama to Perek Chelek, where he articulates a number of very important theological ideas. And in Perek Chelek, the Rambam devotes a great deal of discussion to what is Olam Haba. Because after all, the Mishnah says, Kol Yisrael, Yesh Lahem Chelek Liolam Haba. Every Jew, unless they're excluded, has a share in Olam Haba. So the Rambam wants to devote a lot of time in the Hakdama to Perek Chelek to what is Olam Haba. And there, indeed, he goes on at great length to say that Olam Haba is not physical. And when the Chachamim talk about a meal, right, very often a very common description in rabbinic literature is the great meal of Olam Haba, the great feast, the feast of the Leviathan and the wild ox. I'm sure you've heard the joke, because it says there are two foods that are going to be served. One is the Leviathan, and one is the behemoth, the wild ox. So essentially, you have a choice of meat and fish in the Suda of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the joke goes, because some people aren't even going to trust Hashem's shechita, they're going to demand fish. And it talks about golden tables and wine that has been kept in its grapes from the 6 days of creation. In fact, if you look at the very famous, difficult Aramaic poem that we recite Shavuos morning before Kriyas HaTorah, this is the Piyut of Akdamos. It's very unfortunate. People who are up all night often may fall asleep during Akdamos. But if you look at Akdamos, among other things, is a very, very graphic description of the beauties and the luxuries of Olam Haba, including the rivers of balsam oil that shall go flowing by. And it's a very, very physical description. Gold and silver and the best foods and the like. Well, it's hard to know what Rav Meir Rav Yitzchak, the Mechaber of Akdamos, had in mind. But the Rambam is very, very emphatic, all the way back to his Perek Chelek, that all of that is a metaphor that's not real. Olam Haba is not about physicality, it's not about eating, it's not about drinking, it's not about gold thrones and rivers of balsam oil. Olam Haba is 100% a spiritual existence. The body decomposes in the ground. It is the soul that is eternal. It is the soul that comes from God. It is the soul that is the breath of God. And therefore, just as God can never be destroyed, the soul can never be destroyed. And Olam Haba is the return of the soul to that eternal joy. And therefore, the Rambam makes the point, linguistically, when we say Olam Haba, the world to come, the Rambam says it does not mean a world that's not here yet. The truth is, it's already here. I mean, someone dies today, they go to Olam Haba. So the only reason it's called the world to come is not because it represents a future stage in history. It's a world to come vis-a-vis any given individual. Vis-a-vis you, it's not here yet. You haven't, right? But it's already here, right? So the Rambam Ba'arichos addresses Olam Haba, and he absolutely negates the idea of physicality. Okay, so that would lend a little bit of credence to the accusation that, hey, you don't believe in physical resurrection of the dead. But then the Rambam proceeds to enumerate the very famous 13 principles of faith. If you want to know where you can find the 13 principles of faith in their original incarnation, it is in the Hakdama of the Rambam to Perek Chelek. Again, I think I made this point, but just to repeat it by way of review, if you look in a regular siddur, right, so after Shachris, there are 13 statements, each of them beginning, Ani ma'amin be'emunah shalema. I believe in perfect faith, that there's one God, that God is without body, that there's reward and punishment, that the Torah will never change, all the different principles and the like. So it's important to know that although the Rambam indeed is the author of the 13 principles of faith, the Rambam is not the author of Ani Ma'amin, that whole wording, Ani Ma'amin B'Emunah Shalema. Rather, that was written by an anonymous author who adapted the Rambam's 13 principles in an easier to digest format, in a more simplified format. And that's why occasionally, if there are discrepancies between the Ani Ma'amin description and the Rambam in Perek Chelek, obviously, if you want to know the Rambam's opinion, Perek Chelek is going to control, because those are actually the words of the Rambam, at least in translation, because once again, the Perish Mishnayos was Arabic, and we're reading the Ibn Tibon translations. So why does the Rambam proceed? Just to understand this, why does the Rambam use Perek Chelek as the place where he articulates 13 principles of faith? Because the Rambam has a particular view. You know, you sometimes hear the statement that Judaism is about deed rather than creed. which some people might subscribe to. In other words, there is a shita that actually says, as long as you believe in God and you keep the mitzvot, you're fine. You don't have to go into every detail of theology. I'll mention Rabbi Yosef Albo as an example of this. The Rambam would absolutely disagree with those statements. The Rambam took the position that unless you believe the 13 principles, what he articulated as 13 fundamental dogmas of Judaism, no matter how righteous you are, you do not have a share in the world to come. Meaning, theological belief, correct theological belief, is a sine qua non, it's an indispensable condition. It's the admission ticket for Olam Haba. So, for example, the Rambam maintains, if a person believes that God has a body, that God has physicality, which, after all, you could easily make that mistake based on a number of biblical verses, the hand of God, the eyes of God. The Rambam says, keeps all the mitzvos, he does not have a share in the world to come. Masha Ein Kain, the Rambam maintains, that if a person, for example, believes the 13 principles of faith, but he's not so religious, he violates Shabbos, he violates kosher, so the Rambam says for such a person, he'll go to Gehenna for a while, and after Gehenna, he'll go to Olam Haba for the mitzvahs that he's done. Meaning he doesn't lose Olam Haba by violating the Torah, strangely enough, right? Because God will reward him for his good deeds. And indeed, it's asymmetrical because the punishment of Gehenna is limited in time, and the reward of Olam Haba is infinite in time. But the Rambam says, without the theological beliefs, you're in trouble. And therefore the Rambam says, I must articulate the principles of faith which are necessary for admission to Olam Haba. So he goes through 13 principles, and each of them is given somewhat of an explanation. And of course, principle number 12 is very well known. That's the one that says, I believe in the coming of Mashiach. That's the one that's been set to many nigunim. And then he says, principle number 13. Oh yeah, I got it. Principle number 13, which is literally around less than 10 words. I don't have an exact number of words. He says, oh yeah, there's something called resurrection of the dead, which is an important principle of the Torah. Now, there's something a little funny about this. On one hand, the Rambam, in his letter of Techiyas HaMesim, says, what do you mean I don't believe in physical resurrection? It's in there. It's in there. Look at principle 13. I said it's a fundamental principle of the Torah. Yeah, the Rambam did cover himself all the way back. But there's something a little funny, because when it comes to Olam Haba, the Rambam devotes around a page and a half to say it's not physical and the body is not involved, etc. Meaning he seems to want to negate the notion of eternal physicality. And then he says, oh yeah, there's something called Techiyas HaMesim, which I'm not really going to talk about at all, but it's there. I don't know, what do you make of that? I mean, the Rambam says it is the 13th principle of faith, to be sure. And the Rambam points that out in Igeret Techiyas HaMesim, it's there. On the other hand, he devotes so little energy to it, so little enthusiasm to it. It's one of those things that one could say he's almost ashamed of, in the sense, because the Rambam could not conceive of the body as having any particular significance. This comes across in many, many teachings of the Rambam, in which the Rambam says the only thing that matters is the intellect and the soul. And the body is the body. You got to keep your body healthy, the Rambam said, because that's how the soul and the mind can function. But there's certainly nothing transcendentally significant about the body. Okay, so as I say, some people basically said the Rambam really didn't believe in Techiyas HaMesim, but the Rambam did point to the fact that I said it. Now, similarly, so that's text number 1. Text number 1 is Hakdama to Perek Chelek, in where the Rambam articulates Yud Gimel Ikrei Amuna. He spends a long, long discussion about Olam Haba not being physical. He mentions Techiyas HaMesim in less than 10 words. Okay, yeah.
could it be that it had something to do with Christianity that he didn't want to emphasize?
It is possible. It is possible that the Rambam didn't want to emphasize physical resurrection so much, because that was such a cornerstone of Christianity. That may have some validity. Now, the second text is in the Mishnah Torah, in a part of the Mishnah Torah that is widely studied, but dafka this time of year. That is, the Rambam has a section in the Mishnah Torah that is called Hilchos Tshuva, the laws of repentance. It's very interesting. The Shulchan Aruch does not have anything called the laws of Tshuva. The Rambam does. Rav Chaim Soloveitchik once speculated, the great Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, that there are 10 chapters in Hilchos Tshuva. Perhaps the Rambam intended that one should study one chapter every day in the 10 days from Rosh Hashanah through Yom Kippur. Yes, Sarah Shemei Tshuva. Again, it's a speculation, but perhaps the Rambam intended it that way. And Hilchos Tshuva is divided actually into two unequal halves. The first 4 chapters of Hilchos Tshuva deal with what you might call literally the laws of Tshuva, the obligation of confession to Hashem, the obligation of asking forgiveness from people that you hurt. In other words, the halachic aspects. Tshuva is a mitzvah like other mitzvahs, and it's not just about emotion. There are halachos in how one does tshuva. So the first 4 chapters are devoted to halachos of tshuva. The next 6 chapters are devoted to a number of very intriguing philosophical problems that the idea of tshuva engenders. And among them is the issue of free will. In fact, the Rambam's most extensive discussion of free will, of bechira, as opposed to predestination, appears in Hilchos Tshuva, because you understand the connection here. If I have to do tshuva because when I did something wrong, I have to ask God for forgiveness, I have to make amends, that presupposes responsibility, that presupposes accountability. Now, accountability or responsibility can exist only if a person has free will to choose good or evil. If you were predestined to go on a certain path, then how could you be punished for for following your path? And the other way around, if it was predestined that you would be righteous, why should you be rewarded for being righteous? So the whole idea of reward and punishment, the whole idea of accountability, the whole idea of responsibility depends on there being free will. Moreover, without free will, doing tshuva would be impossible. How could I change if I'm programmed to be a certain way? So the Rambam articulates very much the idea that, based on the statement of the Gemara, everything is in the hands of heaven, except the decision to fear God. The decision to fear God or serve God is your choice. It is not God's choice. And therefore the Rambam discusses bechira, and then the Rambam goes into great detail in a number of very famous questions. Well, how could God harden Paro's heart and make Paro resistant to the Makos, etc.? How could the Egyptians be punished if God told Abraham that they shall enslave your people? Right? How can there be punishment when there's not free will? The Rambam then raises the old chestnut, very famous question of, if God knows the future, then your choice is already foreclosed. God, right? You say, I get up in the morning, I can decide to daven or not daven. Right? That's what we say. I have free will. But how could I have free will if God knew yesterday, and God knew the day before yesterday, and God knew 1,000,000 years or 10,000 years or 10 million years ago what I was going to do? By the time this day arrives, my choices are already foreclosed. So how do you reconcile free will with divine omniscience? So the Rambam raises a whole bunch of interesting questions, reconciling free will with divine knowledge of the future, reconciling free will with God hardening Paro's heart, reconciling free will with God decreeing that the Jews will be enslaved by a nation that is not theirs. I'm not going to discuss those questions. Those are very, very interesting questions. But after the Rambam discusses free will, the Rambam then moves to the nature of reward and punishment. And the Rambam mentions that reward and punishment The ultimate reward is Olam Haba. And once again, the Rambam discusses at length, it is not physical. Physicality is a metaphor for the pleasures that we can understand, because this is a spiritual pleasure we cannot understand. And he makes no reference when he discusses the greatest reward. He makes no reference at all to Tchiyat HaMetim. Again, if one would just read those chapters, one could easily come to the conclusion that the Rambam denied physical resurrection. But once again, in Maimer Techiyat HaMetim, the Rambam points out, I have an insurance policy, because in an earlier part of Hilchos Tshuva, he kind of reiterates with some differences who doesn't have a share in Olam Haba, and he mentions he who does not believe in resurrection. So that's the only reference. In other words, the only reference to physical resurrection in the Mishnah Torah is a single half sentence, HaKofer b'tchiyat hamesim ein lo chelik l'olam haba. But when the Rambam discusses the reward, he only discusses olam haba. He does not discuss tchiyas hamesim. So these are two very peculiar texts, because both in the Hakdama to Perek Chelik and in the Mishnah Torah Hilchos Tshuva, they follow the same pattern. The Rambam has a long, elaborate discussion of the non-physical aspects of Olam Haba, the world of the soul, with a cursory lip service admission. Yeah, there's something called Techiyas HaMesim, and it's a big deal. You got to believe in it. Almost you got to believe in it, etc. So you can understand a little bit, I think, that although the Rambam certainly legitimately claims he's covered his bases, because indeed, he does explicitly say in both places that if you don't believe in Tchiyat HaMetim, you don't have a share in Olam Haba. He says it. On the other hand, the exposition, the enthusiasm, the geschmack, the passion is all directed to the non-physical aspects of Olam Haba. And again, and the Rambam doesn't just call it non-physical, he emphasizes it can't be physical, because bodies don't last forever. Well, how is that consistent with Tchiyas HaMesim and the like? I'll get to that. Now, the third text is the Moreh Nevuchim, the most recent Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam's great philosophical treatise. Here, the Rambam drops any pretense. Tchiyat HaMesim is not mentioned whatsoever in the Moreh Nevuchim. He only mentions the non-spiritual Olam Haba, which is called Olam HaNishamot. So, if you were a scholar, especially if you were looking to pick a fight, as many Talmidei Chachamim in those days did, it was kind of a little bit of an abrasive atmosphere. The Rambam was a target that people liked to attack. You could look at these three texts, the text in the Perush HaMishnayos, the text in the Mishnah Torah, and especially the text in the Moreh Nevuchim, which anyway was very controversial because of its attempt to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Judaism. And one can conclude that the Rambam didn't believe in physical resurrection, and therefore the Rambam was an Epicurus. Now, people who came to the conclusion that the Rambam didn't believe in physical resurrection, they themselves they were into two different groups. Some people said, yeah, that's great. They had actually agreed. They said, yeah, it's a wonderful thing. Let's get rid of this physical resurrection. Maybe it's too connected to Christianity. It's too connected maybe to these superstitions of paganism. After all, what's the body? The only thing that matters is the soul. If the Rambam has gotten rid of physical resurrection, Yasher Koach Kol HaKavod. I mean, some people actually said, that's great. Other people said, apikorsis, kfira. They pointed out, of course, both to the Talmud that says, ha'omer ein techiyas hamesim min haTorah ein lo chelek l'olam haba, and they pointed specifically to Sefer Daniel that speaks, right? Sefer Daniel speaks about those who are sleeping in the ground, yeshenei afar. And of course, what about the Amida? It's very difficult. I mean, you could read it metaphorically, but the second bracha of Shmona Esrei, Mechayei Mesim Atarav Loshia, right? Umekayem Emunato Lishenei Afor. God fulfills his faithful promise to those who are sleeping in the ground. V'ne'emanata lahachayos mesim. And you are trustworthy to revive the dead. Baruch atah Hashem mechayei hamesim. How are you going to interpret that if you don't believe in physical resurrection? I believe, I haven't checked the Reform prayer book recently. I believe the Reform movement fooled around with that bracha. I think they changed language. B'dafka, that it shouldn't reflect physical resurrection of the dead. I believe they did change that, but the Rambam obviously didn't change that. The Rambam had the regular Shemona Esrei. So it's a big dochak. I mean, theoretically, you might say, well, maybe revival of the dead means the soul comes back, but that doesn't make sense really, because the soul doesn't come back. The soul, in other words, a person dies, all right, it may be Gehenna or whatever, but it's not that the soul will come back. The soul is in Olam Haba now. I mean, if you're talking about something coming back, that description only makes sense if you're talking about physical resurrection. Because if the soul coming back, if coming back is a reference to the soul coming back is not the right word. The soul never dies. It's not like the soul dies and then God revives the soul. So l'chaira, although the Rambam does not bring this as a proof, but l'chara, the nusach of tefillah itself, which comes back from the Anshe Knesset Agdola, as well as the pasuk in Daniel, clearly talk about physical resurrection of the dead. So again, some of the more philosophically minded people liked the fact that the Rambam was a progressive who was moving away from that primitivism. Others thought the Rambam was not Bikoris. The Rambam wrote this defense, and he pointed to the fact that in the Perish Mishnayos and in the Mishnah Torah, he explicitly does mention Techiyat HaMesim, albeit without that much enthusiasm. In the Moreh Nevuchim, he doesn't, but I'll explain that. Okay. So, yeah.
What about the Kabbalistic idea that Adam had a body of light, and only after he sinned with Eve that he became opaque? Is it possible he could have a resurrection of body with light?
Well, yes. Yeah. Well, we'll talk about that. Meaning, what type of body gets resurrected? That's an important question. But the question is, does the Rambam subscribe to bodily resurrection? And then we'll talk about what body gets resurrected. Certainly, the Derech Hashem, Ramosha Chaim Lutzato, who was a phenomenally great Kabbalist, talks about the fact that bodily resurrection does not mean the actual opaque body that we have. It's a much more spiritualized body, but it's still a body that gets unified with the soul. So the Rambam then has to address a very big question. Yeah, the Rambam covered his bases, and the Rambam did affirm belief in bodily resurrection. So he has been exonerated of the Apikoros charge. At least this was his position. Question is, though, why does he de-emphasize it so much? Why is all of the elaborate discussion, Olam Haba, Techiyat HaMesim is a passing footnote, and in the Moreh Nevuchim, it's totally ignored? So here, the Rambam says something that's quite astounding, quite amazing, and he does not mention this in the Mishnah Torah. Again, he mentions the words Techiyat HaMesim, but he doesn't discuss what it is in the Mishnah Torah. And he says, Techiyat HaMesim is a passing phenomenon. God will bring the dead back to life. Yeah, that's great, and that's a great supernatural miracle. But they're going to die then, meaning to say, Techiyat HaMesim is not the eternal reward for Torah and for mitzvahs. Techiyat HaMesim is a miracle like the splitting of the Red Sea, like the falling of the man, like the opening up of the ground, for Korach, like the talking of the donkey. It's a miracle, like other miracles. But those who come back, they may live for a while, but they're going to die. And therefore, and what's going to happen when they die? They'll go to Olam Haba, meaning the only thing that is the eternal reward for God's mitzvot is not resurrection of the dead. It is Olam Haba. Right. And therefore, it is Olam Haba. And therefore, the Rambam says, when I discuss in Hilchot Shuvah the ultimate reward for mitzvot, I don't mention Techiyat. So I mention Techiyat HaMesim as a condition to get Olam Haba. But when I discuss the reward for mitzvot, I only talk about Olam Haba. I don't talk about Techiyat HaMesim, because Techiyat HaMesim is not a reward. It is simply a miracle that God will perform to demonstrate his might and demonstrate his mastery and demonstrate his control over nature. But in terms of the what you might call the eschatological process, the process of reward and punishment, Techiyat HaMesim is frankly not very important. Now, this is a remarkable position. I will mention in a second how other people view it. But even accepting the Rambam's premise, the question then becomes, so why is it a foundation of faith? Meaning, okay, it'll happen. But what makes it so important? And number two, why would God do it? Well, why does God have to do that particular miracle? Again, let me contrast for a moment the Rambam's view on the 13 principles of faith, where the Rambam says you must have commitment to the 13 principles as an admission ticket to Olam Haba, and without that commitment, you have no share in Olam Haba, which, by the way, can create tremendous hardships, because if you think about this, this condemns a tremendously high percentage of the Jewish people, the Rambam's view at least, to not having a share in Olam Haba, even if they're good and they're righteous. That's why many argue with the Rambam. But let me mention that a later philosopher, Rav Yosef Albo, wrote a very famous book in Jewish philosophy. It is called Sefer HaIkarim, the Book of Fundamental Principles, which is a much more readable book than the Moreh Nevuchim. It is not as difficult as the Guide to the Perplexed. And as a result, Sefer HaIkarim became a very popular book. It's not so studied today, unfortunately, but in the late Middle Ages, it was a very, very popular book. And it's funny, because it's an easy-to-read book, people read it, even though Sefer HaIkarim is actually a very radical book, because he takes tremendous issue with the Rambam. And let me explain what he does. Rav Yosef Albo says that the Rambam defined 13 principles as Ikarei Emunah. Ikarei Emunah, fundamental principles of faith, but the word Ikar comes from the word root, and Ikar is the same as a shorish. This is the root from which comes the tree of Judaism. And just as a tree cannot live without roots, you cannot be Jewish without adherence to the 13 root principles of Judaism. That is the Rambam's view. Rav Yosef Albo maintains that many of the things that the Rambam called Ikar are not Ikar, they are Anaf. He said some things are roots and some things are branches. A tree cannot live without roots, but a tree can live even if it's missing some of the branches. And Rav Albo maintained, and he brought many proofs to this, that many of the Ikarim of the Rambam are not Ikarim, they are Anafim, and even if a Jew did not believe them, they can still be a Jew in good standing, and they will have a share in Olam Haba. Rav Albo famously said, instead of there being 13 Ikarei Emunah, there are only 3 ikarei emunah. Only 3 things a Jew has to believe. Number 1, that there is one God who is the creator of heaven and earth. You have to believe in God. So I know that there's something called humanistic Judaism, which actually says they don't believe in God. It's open. I mean, somehow they do have synagogue services. I'm not really sure what that means. It's not reform. It's humanism is a totally different thing. Humanism is literally a Judaism that doesn't believe in God. So even Rav would say you got to believe in God. Number 2, you have to believe in some system of reward and punishment. It could be this world, the next world, but you have to believe that there are consequences to your behavior. Because if there are no consequences, why should I follow anything? And number 3, you have to believe in the divine revelation of the Torah that God communicated to us in some form what his will is, so we know what is good and evil. Okay, so the 3 ikarei emunah, mitziyut Hashem, the existence of God, one God, sechar v'onesh, some system of reward and punishment, and some system of divine revelation. Rav Albo writes that this is actually the structure of the Musaf on Rosh Hashanah, where the Musaf on Rosh Hashanah has 3 special brachot that we add to the Musaf, after which we blow the shofar after each special bracha. The first is Malchiot, in which we recite biblical verses proclaiming God as King. The second is Zichronot, where we recite biblical verses about God remembering the good deeds of our forefathers. And then we have Shofarot, which are verses about the blowing of the shofar. Malchuyot, Zichronot, Shofarot. Rav Albo is masber that since Rosh Hashanah we are coronating God as our King, we pledge our allegiance to the 3 fundamental principles of Judaism as exemplified in Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. Malchiot essentially proclaims the existence of God. That's why he's our King. Zichronot connotes reward and punishment, because God remembers the good deeds of our forefathers. And Shofarot commemorates, among other things, the shofar of Matan Torah. So Rav Albo says the 3 ikarei emunah are part of our affirmation on the day that we coronate God as our King. Right? Very good, nice explanation of Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. In fact, one of the reasons why this Sefer Ikarim became very popular is because he often digresses to offer explanations of the Siddur or whatever it is. The Rambam tends not to do that. The Rambam tends to stick to his philosophical argument. Now, in order to have clarity between the difference between the Rambam's approach and Rav Albo's approach, let me take a few examples. Let's say a person does not believe in the coming of Mashiach. He says, who needs Mashiach? When I die, my soul goes to God. If I deserve it, I'll get rewarded in Olam Haba. I don't need Mashiach. According to the Rambam, Biat HaMashiach is the 12th fundamental principle of faith. A person who does not believe Biat HaMashiach is a kofer bi'ikar. He is denying a fundamental principle, ein lo chelek li'olam haba. The same thing would be true, even like the Rambam, if I denied physical resurrection. Even in the Rambam's limited sense, because the Rambam calls Techiyat HaMeitim principle number 13. You know what Rav Albo would say? Rav Albo would say, well, wait a second here. Instead of looking at Mashiach and Techiyat HaMeitim. As Ikar, it is simply a branch of a more general principle called reward and punishment. So as long as I believe in reward and punishment, which include Olam Haba, even if I am mistaken in denying Mashiach or Techiyat HaMeitim, I am a mistaken Jew, but a mistaken Jew is not the same as a heretical Jew. Now, here's a critical point I want to clarify. A lot of people misunderstand Rav Albo's point. They will say something like, Rav Albo didn't believe in Mashiach. Rav Albo didn't believe in Techiyat HaMeitim. That's actually wrong. Rav Albo believed in everything the Rambam believed in. Meaning, there is no difference at all as to what are the true beliefs of Judaism and what are not. The only point that Rav Albo departs from the Rambam is, what are the consequences of having a mistaken belief? It is a mistaken belief. But Rav Albo says, a mistaken belief on a branch does not affect your Olam Haba. It is only a mistaken belief on an Ikar that affects your Olam Haba. And the Rambam's classification of Ikar was too extensive. Okay, again, this point is worthwhile to repeat. Rav Albo does not disagree with the Rambam on the substance of the beliefs of Judaism. He just disagrees as to how you classify them. Now, let me give you some more dramatic examples. Let's say a person, based on the anthropomorphic descriptions in Tanakh, believes that God is an old man sitting, not an old man, but an old person with a long white beard sitting on a throne, which is exactly the way the book of Daniel describes him. According to the Rambam, anyone that says God has a body is denying one of the 13 principles of faith, does not have a share in Olam Haba. What would Rav Albo say? Rav Albo would say, it's certainly the case that God does not have a body, but if somebody made a mistake and think he does, he's a mistaken person. He's not a heretic. So again, I want to point out, if people will tell you, Rav Yosef Al will believe that God was corporeal, that's not true. But he's saying, you don't lose your Olam Haba. Or, let me mention something, another thing. The Rambam posits as an Iker Emunah that every single letter in the Torah, perhaps except for maybe the last 8 verses that talk about Moshe's death, was dictated by God to Moshe. And the Torah that we have today is the very same Torah that was given to Moshe. There were no additions, no deletions. Now, as you know, there are some verses in the Torah that create a little bit of a problem. The Torah sometimes seems to be referring to things that happened after Moshe's life. So the Rambam's answer would be, these were prophetic, meaning God told Moshe about things that will happen, etc. Rav Albo will say that as long as you believe that the mitzvot of the Torah come from God, and that is divine revelation, the mitzvot of the Torah do not come from man, they come from God. The when and the where and the how and the possibility of post-Mosaic additions on an editorial level that do not change the substance of commandments are admissible within the faith tradition of Judaism. again, I'm not here to convince you of anything. All I want to do is very simply articulate the difference in Gisha between Rav Albo and the Rambam. So according to Rav Albo, well, if the Rambam would have agreed with Rav Yosef Albo, which he didn't, the Rambam wouldn't be in trouble at all. The Rambam is accused of not believing in physical resurrection, and therefore he's an apikoros. Well, if Rav Alba would have been his defense attorney, Rav Alba would say, yeah, okay, he didn't believe in physical resurrection. So what? You don't have to believe in physical resurrection as long as you believe in Sechar v'Onesh. The problem is the Rambam couldn't use Rav Alba as his defense attorney because Rav Alba wasn't born yet, because the Rambam B'dafka says you have 13 principles of faith, that if you're a kofar, you're in trouble. And one of those principles is, indeed, the principle of resurrection of the dead. So it's fascinating that, in a sense, the Rambam painted himself into a corner. The Rambam's definition of an apikoros made him open to the accusation that he was an apikoros under his definition, although theoretically there were alternative definitions that would have saved him, right? So he destroyed his own alibi in a way. So the bottom line, and we'll stop here, the bottom line basically is that the Rambam does have textual proof in his own texts that, hey, I do believe in physical resurrection, but he greatly, greatly, greatly diminishes its significance. And the question then becomes, so what is the point of it if it just means the dead will come back and then they're going to die again, and the only thing that lasts is Olam Haba? Yeah, you've given lip service that there'll be resurrection of the dead, but what is the significance of Techiyat HaMesim? That is a huge question, and the Rambam, frankly, does not fully address it, but we'll talk about it in Rishis from next week. Have a good week.